want to start off by telling you the story about Tanya and Eddie. Tanya met Eddie at the apartment she lived in, and he was nice, and they talked and flirted. Now this seems typical, except for the fact that Tanya was just 13 years old, and Eddie was 43. Their relationship took a turn when they were at a party, and Eddie told Tanya that she had to sleep with this random man that she had never met before for money. She was very hesitant, but after consistent persuasion, she agreed. She thought it would be a one-time thing, and she wanted to make Eddie happy, but soon it became an everyday routine. Night after night and bar after bar, Eddie would advertise Tanya to the potential predators. The physical and mental effects that this would have on Tanya would be devastating. Tanya's story is absolutely horrific, but it is not rare. What is rare is that Special Agent Keith Owens heard about Eddie's actions, and him and his team arrested Eddie on human trafficking charges. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Tanya got out. Most victims do not. Human trafficking is on the rise in America and throughout the world, and it is important to know the history and the signs of human trafficking, along with what the government and private agencies are doing to stop this evolving, horrific crime. Now, first, I will discuss when human trafficking began. I will do a deep dive into the history of human trafficking in order to get a full understanding about where human trafficking comes from in order to see how we got to today. Second, I will discuss how human trafficking happens. I will speak over the signs of human trafficking in order to inform potential victims about this upcoming issue. And finally, I will discuss the government and private agencies' plans to put an end to human trafficking. Now, before we can look at the possible solutions, we must first look at the history of human trafficking. Human trafficking. So what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is a crime that involves coercing a person or provide labor or commercial sexual acts to someone. This coercion can be direct, physical, or psychological. Now, where human trafficking began. The earliest form of human trafficking can be tied back to the African slave trade. Africans were kidnapped and sent across the seas to many different countries and imported into forced labor. Now, after slavery was outlawed by the United States in 1865, there came a new form of human trafficking known as white slavery. Now, white slavery was human trafficking involved through forced prostitution, through drugs, deceit, or through the use of force. White slavery would eventually be criminalized with the signing of the International Convention for the Suppression of the White Slave Trade in 1910. In 1921, the League of Nations signed the International Convention for the Suppression of Traffic in Women and Children. Now, this was a major historical event because it was the first time human trafficking was acknowledged not only for white women, but for all women and male and female children. Now, trafficking continues to be a problem throughout the world. It continues to spread geographically and by the pure amounts of cases. The United Nations criminalized human trafficking under the Protocols of Transactional Organized Crime in 2000. Now, while in the original discussions of human trafficking in America, they were centered on sexual exploitation of women, the conversation has changed. Sex trafficking of women has been decreasing the number of shares of human trafficking cases. Forced labor took up 40% of all cases in 2011. Human trafficking in women is decreasing steadily, and this would be good news if it wasn't being replaced with an increase in trafficking involving young girls. There are still governments who have yet to criminalize any form of human trafficking, and this leaves roughly 2 billion people unprotected from these crimes. Now, there is such a widespread market for human trafficking that it is almost impossible for governments or agencies to investigate each group. And when governments refuse to keep their citizens safe, they leave it up to the citizens to protect themselves. The best way to combat human trafficking is prevention. So what are the signs and patterns seen within human trafficking operations? First, we must look at who are the traffickers and who are the targets. Now, when people think of a human trafficker, they probably think of someone who is tall, maybe a man, white, black. Overall, you can look at this person and you can tell that you should stay away from them. This could not be farther from the truth. In fact, that there is no evidence that there are any sort of data that traffickers are any sort of nationality, sexual orientation, or gender. They could be the neighbor next door, in your family, or an acquaintance. The problem is that there is no definitive look to what the traffickers look like. Now, while there is no pattern in the traffickers, there is a pattern in who the victims are. Now, when looking at the recent evidence, it suggests that people of color and members of the LGBTQ+ community are much more likely to be in danger. The generational trauma, discrimination, and oppression all create community-wide vulnerabilities. Traffickers know how to play into and take advantage of said vulnerabilities and can lead people in. Now, how they lure people in. The key to a trafficker's game are the stories that they tell. They convince their vulnerable victims that they are absolutely in love with them, that they are soulmates bound to last forever, or they offer a job that is so amazing, and they offer benefits and vacations and time off, and people become so blinded by the possibility of better futures that they cannot see the signs. We as the family members, co-workers, and friends must recognize the signs that people may be in trouble. Being vigilant and listening to that gut feeling is what saves more lives than people get credit for. Now, there are two main types of human trafficking. There's labor trafficking and sex trafficking. As I mentioned earlier, labor trafficking is on the rise, so it is important to recognize the signs. Labor trafficking includes situations where people are forced to work. They keep people working because of debt, immigration status, or violence. The traffickers like to keep people isolated emotionally and physically. Now, recognizing sex trafficking, according to the Polaris Project, occurs when individuals are made to perform commercial sex through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. The thing about these traffickers, and similar to Tanya's story, is the way that they can coerce their victims. They tell them about how much money they'll make for their future together. They'll tell them that they love them. They do this to the point where the victims don't even know that they are victims. And I know I am emphasizing the importance of the people recognizing and preventing human trafficking, but there are government and private companies who work to stop human trafficking, such as the Polaris Project. The Polaris Project is a data-driven social justice movement to fight human trafficking. Polaris has assisted thousands of victims and survivors and helped to ensure that countless traffickers were held accountable for their crimes. This organization is outstanding in fighting the human trafficking crisis, and one of the biggest ways they do this is running the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The hotline is open 24/7 for victims to safely exit their environments. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 has essentially laid the groundwork for the federal response to human trafficking. Now, this law, of course, has been updated since 2000 as human trafficking evolves itself. The most recent piece of legislation directly tied to human trafficking was in 2019 when the Congress appropriated $250 million toward human trafficking protection efforts. The United States government has a zero-tolerance policy regarding human trafficking, and they have allotted many different agencies in order to help with this widespread issue. Some of these agencies include the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or the DHS, are the people who investigate a large portion of sex and labor trafficking when involving foreign nationals. They work to prevent human trafficking across the border. And another department that is involved in protection of human trafficking is the FBI. The FBI handles and investigates the domestic minor sex trafficking cases, and they actually launched their Innocence Lost initiative to put an end to any form of child trafficking. And finally, the Justice Department leads all of the federal prosecutions, and they fund the state and local law enforcement agencies so that they may create their own human trafficking task forces. Now, today I first discussed the history of human trafficking. We looked at how human trafficking has evolved, starting from the African slave trade all the way down to the modern human trafficking we see today. The next thing I discussed was the signs and scenarios of human trafficking. I presented this information in order to warn potential victims about the scenarios and many forms human trafficking takes on. And finally, I discussed what the government and private agencies are doing in order to prevent human trafficking. This was because it is important to know the history and the signs of human trafficking, along with what the government and private agencies are doing to stop this evolving horrific crime. In conclusion, the government and its agencies are doing the best they can to prevent human trafficking. They've allotted more funds and created more agencies to try and get a hold of this growing issue. The problem is how difficult it is to break up human trafficking rings. There are at least 600 known trafficking flows around the world. They are quick and discreet, and they can deceive their victims so well that the crime is overall very low risk to them. That is why we must emphasize and encourage people to gain knowledge about the signs and scenarios of human trafficking. We must protect the victims and hear their stories in order to evolve our methods of preventing human trafficking as the crime evolves itself. The government cannot always save us, so we must protect ourselves and the people around us in order to take the fight into our own hands. Tanya may have made it out of her situation, but she was a lucky one. Many people do not. I will leave you all with this. Trust your gut. You know what is sketchy and what is not. If you may have a bad feeling about something, call the hotline and they can walk you through it. Tell a friend so that they may look after your safety. Human trafficking is not blind to any race, gender, or sexual orientation. It can happen, and does happen to many people. Recognize the signs, safely get out of the situation, and report to the proper authorities.